Howdy, everybody. Humanities, film studies, Shasta College. This is February 24th, Wednesday, 2021. Year into the pandemic. Hope you guys are all doing well. Hope we're getting through this mess. I'll start grading your papers very soon. Your second essays, I see most of them are handed in. And I'll start grading those and just pay attention to the comments. And if there's very little comments, it's because I'd have very little to say. I'm not going to pat everybody on the shoulder if you do a great job. Unless you do a really great job, then you'll get a thumbs up and a smiley face. I'm just kidding. But do pay attention to the comments because it'll indicate what's lacking in the essay, and hopefully you can make it better for the next one. Also, I mentioned my office hours and how you could contact me, either email me or text me and set up a Zoom meeting. I've done a couple of them already. So give me a couple day notice, and then I'll give you a couple options, and then we'll meet. Okay? Talk about whatever you want to talk about. Okay, good. I look forward to meeting you one by one. I guess that's how we do it now. Today, I want to talk about two really, really important. Well, of course, everything I'm discussing is important in the history of film. We're coming out of these two. I'm going to try to cover two today, briefly. Two milestones in film came out of World War II. We're past the war now. The war is over. Europe is changing. It's starting to recuperate from the war, and people in Italy and other countries are starting to crank up the cinema cameras. Japan, the same way. After we dropped the atom bomb on Japan, we occupied them for roughly 10 years. They didn't. Essentially, we are the occupiers of Japan, and they didn't have. It was essentially our law, American law. But filmmakers were starting to make films again, even though they're being occupied by us. And so people like Ozo and Akira Kurosawa are making films again, which is a good thing. The power of cinema is that strong that even though we completely bombed two cities out of existence and carpet bombed Tokyo also, the desire to make film overcame all that. And that's why cinema is so important in connecting the humanity all around the world. And then we see what we have in common with our enemies, who are no longer enemies, and we see the similarities and the differences. So in the United States, which I'm going to focus on today, we're coming out of the Italian NeoRealism, and a new movement in film is essentially popping up. And the French called it film noir, black film. And this isn't a racial thing, folks. It's a metaphor. That's essentially what noir means, black or dark. And film, you know what that is. Film is film. That's the film stock. But also, it's what we call movies. Instead of calling these black movies, they're called black film. Film noir. It's one of my favorite genres. It's because many, many reasons. But I'm going to try to cover a couple of those. And please do go to Canvas and watch the little mini documentaries that I'll have posted on there about film noir. um, and perhaps start a discussion. Maybe I'll talk about that later. Film noir came out of essentially directors, actors, writers who had fought, served their country in World War II, and they'd seen and done things that they never thought was possible. And they saw not only the inhumanity to man, but also the humanity and the survivors of bombings and mass shootings and warfare and battlefields. They saw a lot of things that they never seen before or experienced personally. And so when they came back to this country, there was a dissatisfaction of going back to the way things were before the war. Like everything was great and we all had wonderful lives and we're just making musicals and screwball comedies and everything was just good entertainment as usual. Not to be. People started putting out more adult content. When I mean adult, folks, I'm never talking about X-rated sexual content. I'm talking about emotional content for adults. And the film noir title kit has been bantered around for films before World War II, but they weren't calling it noir then. Actually, film noir was never called noir during its heyday, which would be late 40s to mid 50s, 1950s. That term came about through a magazine, which I'm going to refer to quite a bit, especially when we start talking about the French New Wave cinema in a couple of weeks. Cahiers de Cinema, which was essentially a journal on cinema. They took cinema and they wrote about it in an intellectual, critical way, essays, which like what hopefully you're doing, and they explained the deeper meaning, the deeper insights to our own cinema. It's like, and they started seeing things that possibly the general public didn't see. They started analyzing and piecing the dots together on the humanity that connects us all. So they started writing about our filmmakers, American filmmakers, people like John Ford, which we've talked about, people like Albert Hitchcock. I'll cover him a little bit later in more detail. And he was there making these, they're declaring them auteur filmmakers. Auteur, that's a key phrase really from now until the end of this class. Auteur is another French word, means author. Author of your own work, essentially. Now, as we go along, and if you ever did buy either book and go to the glossaries, you'll see how these words are defined on either textbooks, the How to Write About Movies and the textbook Story of Film. And it talks about the definitions and it shows you examples of film noir and why it's an important movement in this country. So these directors and writers and actors, and when I say actors, I'm talking male and female. I don't like to use the term actress anymore. It defines it as a female thing. I'll just say actors, and if it's a female, I'll say female actor or female actor or male actor. The actress part is kind of gone out of style and out of fashion. We don't need to put anybody in categories like that. So what we have now is some films that were coming out, definitely influenced by the Italian neorealism that they'd seen in those films I talked about last week or the other day, Rome, Open City, Bicycle Thieves, and others. And they thought, well, that looks like something we could pull off, and that's more in line of how we're feeling and seeing the world now that we've come through this war somehow in one piece, and we've got a story to tell. And maybe it's not going to be that pleasant. Maybe it's not going to be a fairy tale where everybody ends up happy ever after. Maybe it's going to be a waking nightmare. and most in the nightmares happening. And so all these films, I would say across the board, were filmed in glorious black and white. And they had low budgets. A lot of these films came out of Warner Brothers, which was always considered kind of the low budget studio to go to for some reason. Each studio had their own brand. MGM had musicals, and Paramount had comedies, and others had horror movies, monster movies, and Warner Brothers had essentially these types of films: noir, detective fiction. Starred quite a bit of them starred Humphrey Bogart and other people. The Warner Brothers knew how. They're actually brothers, folks. Jack Warner and his brothers, who started the studios, they were money guys. They know how to make money, and this was their niche in the cinema category of like the Coyote Cinema said, it's their category, their genre. And film noir is definitely a genre of a style. Usually, because the budgets were relatively low, there's not a lot of lighting in these things. They mostly take place at night. And so when you see offices and houses, it's usually low lighting. And we're not talking usually about families here, folks. We're talking about outsiders who thrive at night. What happens when the city sleeps? That's a great film noir, by the way, movie. Bad people come out at night, supposedly, and they're operating. They're doing their bad thing. They're pushing crime somehow. And there's the people who are after them, and the people who are trying to get away from them, and then there's the people who get caught up in the middle. So film noir, that's the stories that are usually being told. Our darker side of our humanity, not the light side. Our mistrust for most people, our mistrust for authority, our mistrust for the social norms, whatever those might have been. Even the American dream had gone bust. It looked pretty bleak out there. And so these movies reflected that. And so a movie like Detour, which I'll show you, looking for some clips, I'll show you on Canvas. Detour is about a musician, a guy who's pretty good, he's just a drifting musician, and he's hitchhiking. And he gets in over his head. That's always what happens. Circumstances. They didn't plan it, but he didn't walk away from it either. And it's all good film noirs usually involve a male who is not a bad person, but he just makes bad decisions, usually based on either greed or a woman. And that woman is referred to in a French term as a fatale, a femme fatale, the fatal woman. And just about every film noir has them. Postman always rings. Lana Turner is the femme fatale who tricks. Yikes! I can't think of his name. Great film noir actor. I'm just drawing a blank on. I should write this stuff down once in a while. Tricks him. Geez, I almost got it. Garfield, and it tricks him into murdering her husband for her. If he just murders the husband, she will get the husband's insurance policy and then he will get her. And so she knows how to use her sexuality to get this person who was not a bad person to begin with, but who is corruptible, especially with a pretty woman. And of course, it ends in disaster. It ends with him in the gas chamber and she turning him in when they finally come get her because she's going to sell him out. Early on, before post-World War II, which all these films mostly are, there was a couple during World War II that some people call Citizen Kane a film noir. Does it really work? On some levels, it does. Uh, a lot of Citizen Kane does take place at night, and there's a lot of shadowy lighting, bright light or blacks in the corners. Nothing's totally clear. Is there a femme fatale in it? You could possibly see the singer is his femme fatale. The one he tries to make into an opera singer and fails. That is his undoing. So it follows some of the criteria, but I don't really care for that term on Citizen Kane. I don't think it applies totally, but it does apply to Double Indemnity, which is a Billy Wilder film and about a woman, Barbara Stanwyck, who's married to a wealthy guy, and here comes a hapless insurance salesman played by Fred McMurray, and she can see how he's checking her out, and so she uses her sexuality and ensnares him in a plot to kill her husband for the insurance money. And he is so tangled in her Black Widow's web that he goes along with it. And folks, nothing's good going to come from it. They're going to betray each other. He's going to kill her, and then he's going to end up confessing all to the murder, to everything. His downfall is a femme fatale. But she's not going to make it either. Out of the Past is a great noir movie with Robert Mitchum, and the femme fatale in this literally shoots him in the car at the end, but then she's gunned down by police. That's how powerful she is. She's willing to go down fighting with a gun the police. And she'll take her man down if he betrays her after she's betrayed him, of course. He's that sucked into her sexual orbit that he cannot essentially escape it. And he's compromised morally, ethically, and it's fatal. So these movies thrived after World War II because the country had been through the war, a lot of loss of life and belief systems, and these films filled the void of not wanting to see a fairy tale, usual Hollywood fairy tale. They wanted to see something more how they were feeling. And so these movies thrive. And there's lots of film noir. They really don't make them anymore. The closest to a film noir right now would be Pulp Fiction, although it's in color, doesn't matter. There's been a couple of attempts at film noir, modern attempts. LA Confidential could be one. There's a femme fatale there who gets Russell Crowe, almost gets him killed. Pulp Fiction's got Uma Thurman as the femme fatale, almost gets herself killed, and maybe is responsible for the death of John Travolta's character. He gets in over his head with her. He's out with the boss's wife, which is not good. And she knows how to manipulate men around her little finger. Anyway, other film noirs are still out there. They're still being made. We don't have many private detectives anymore, so that aspect is kind of over because now with the internet, you can be a private detective without ever leaving your office. But being a private detective investigator was a popular thing. It came out of Pulp Fiction novels. People like Raymond Chandler, who are a phenomenal writer, Dashiell Hammett, James N. Cain. These are writers that were writing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in America, and they wrote about the darker side of things. And a lot of their movies were made into these. A lot of their books, I should say, were made into the movie, and the dialogue, the crisp, no nonsense, ironic, and very clever and sometimes funny dialogue. Um, they're always drinking whiskey. They all wear suit and ties and hats, and are all packing heat. And they're cracking wise because they might not live that long. They're smoking a lot of cigarettes, folks. So those authors are very, very important to film noir. When we started recovering from the war, things started looking up. We started looking for other things besides these dark stories to tell. Um, you don't know this, but I've made a couple films as a writer and director, and my dream was always to make a film noir western. Which it's been sort of done. Black and white western about, but a noir genre, noir themes and noir signifiers, and the femme fatale, the whole bit, and the good man being brought down by his bad judgment. So it's a wonderful genre, an important genre, and please look at the clips. I'll show you guys once I post them in modules. I'll do it today or tomorrow, and you'll see them. Watch them, and I'll probably ask you to start a discussion what you think about it. Also, I want you to talk about this too. I'm just going to talk about this for 10 minutes. I'll let you go. During this time, also, a very important thing was happening across America. We're coming out of World War II, and we were allies with the Soviet Union, which was communist. But now that the war is over, we're back to what they call the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had gone from being Russia, and when it became communist, they dropped the name because they don't like. They wanted to make a new country, a new start, and they encompassed a lot of countries that just wasn't Russia, and they called it the Soviet Union, and they became very powerful. In World War II, we were allies with Stalin, along with Churchill in England, and Franklin Roosevelt, and we needed Russia, and they needed us. Germany had attacked Russia on the Russian front, and the Battle of Stalingrad, 7 million people died. Civilians, a lot of civilians. Stalin hated Hitler. He hated fascism. He hated Nazis, even though he's a communist. He didn't define himself as a fascist. So after the war, they become our common enemy. And there is a urban myth, or I don't know if that's the right word for it, in mythology, that communists and their manifestos to spread the word throughout the world, no matter what it takes. And so a lot of people took that to heart. They still do in some areas. There's no more Soviet Union, but there is China. And if you just saw the newest protests and Trump and all this over the elections, people were starting to call other people communists again as a bad thing. So how far have we gone since the demise of the Soviet Union? Now they are Russia again, by the way, but they're a dictatorship. Putin doesn't ever get fairly elected, and he kills his adversaries. And he runs the country like a dictator that it cannot be removed from office. And if you protest him, they just had protests in Russia, and they literally arrested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of peaceful protesters who want more of an open democracy in that country, and they want a more of an open saying in what their government officials provide them. Putin is a strong man, and he's going to keep them at bay. Same as in China. They hate dissension. That's their worst thing, and so they keep people at bay through might. They've got the army, they got the power, they got the might. So during the 1950s, because of the threat of communists, and we thought they were going to spread their word, their corruption around the world, and they tried. They got into Cuba, and then thus we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba went communist. They stayed communist, even though they failed. Communism has mostly failed everywhere. Um, and so, as a construct, it is a failed construct. Um, but during this time, we didn't know. It looked like it was pretty powerful. And so they started looking in this country, I'm saying the government, started looking for subversive activity, communist activity in this country, thinking that perhaps there were infiltrators here, agents that were going to corrupt our general public into wanting a communist type of government. Um, if you've ever read anything Karl Marx, communism is based on Marxism. Karl Marx was a German who wrote a book and on Marxism, and it's quite a bit different than communism. It's not based on might or totalitarian government. It's based on essentially everybody is treated equally. Fair play. Why should one person have much more than the other person? Okay, you think, well, because they work harder. Well, in this country, a lot of times people don't work very hard and they get a lot. You could play the stock market and become rich. Is that working hard? Is that building things? And the people who actually build things don't get those big payoffs like they do, say, on Wall Street or the .com industry, wherever people make huge money now. So the workers in this country do have kind of we're still struggling to a piece of it all. And so during the 50s, it looked like the communist threat was real to a certain extent, and because we just didn't know. And so they started looking at Hollywood, thinking, well, of course, that's where all the corruption comes. And that theory sort of comes still is to this day. There's a lot of people who believe Hollywood is full of nothing but liberals who are rich liberals who are voting, for all the wacky Democrats, and they're all hanging out in their hot tubs doing mounds of cocaine. There's still a perception with some people that that's what Hollywood's about. Well, how do you foster a movement? You go after popular celebrities. And so during the government conducted what they call House on Un-American Activities. And there were several people involved in it, but the main person in that was a junior senator named Joseph McCarthy. Maybe you've heard of McCarthyism. That's not a good term, folks. It's become a term that means an anti-communist, they're coming for you. And if you have any political ideas that's not like their ideas, they are going to destroy you. They're going to take your job away, maybe take your house away. And that's what he did. He went after Hollywood, and his people went after Hollywood. And he had a lot of powerful lawyers behind him, and they started these hearings. And they brought in celebrities, Hollywood celebrities, big ones. Gary Cooper, Robert Taylor, Walt Disney, to testify in a hearing. It wasn't a court of law, but it was a Senate hearing to see if they were communists, if they've ever been a communist, or do they know any communists? Communism got its foothold in America during the Great Depression in the 30s. People started losing faith in the government in the 30s because it wasn't providing. It looked like democracy as we knew it up until that point wasn't working for the average working guy. There were no more jobs. People didn't have their rent. They couldn't feed their kids. There was a lot of desperation. And so communist parties started popping up in New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, usually big urban areas. Um, and so people would go to meetings to check it out. And it sounded pretty good. Look, you want to have this a job, you want to have a house, you want to feed your kids. Well, communism is the way to do that, not this other way. And so a lot of impressionable people, artists especially, actors, directors, filmmakers, Broadway playwrights, painters, they actually joined the Communist Party in the 30s. They paid fees, had weekly meetings. And once they saw the truth of communism, folks, this is long before social network, long before the internet. We don't know what's going on in Russia. We don't have any idea really, or China. But when it started trickling back out, what was going on with Stalin, you know how Stalin had his own people executed? Same with in China. They backed off. They saw the truth that communism wasn't the way to go. It was a failed, evil, another evil dictatorship. And most of these people quit the Communist Party. And now, 10 years later, they're asked in a Senate hearings, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Yes or no? So the ones who didn't want to testify were or name names of friends who were communists, and there was a lot of those, were given contempt of court. And a bunch of people, dozens, had to spend a year in prison. There was the screenwriters, so very big screenwriters of the day, Academy Award-winning screenwriters, who refused to answer the committee's questions, and they were giving a year in prison in contempt. They lost their jobs. They were blacklisted from working again in Hollywood. If a producer hired them, they would lose their job. They had to go to prison for a year. How are they going to feed their families? There's a little miniature documentary I'm going to ask you guys to look at, the Hollywood 10. Look at it, check it out, tell me what you think in a discussion. I'll post this all in the next 24 hours. And then there were some actors and directors who provided information. Yes, I was a communist. I'm no longer a communist. Do you know any communists? Yes, I do. What are their names? Well, some of those people, and there were some very big people, actors and celebrities who cooperated with the Senate hearing, and always were looked down upon afterwards. One of them was the great director Elia Kazan, who had directed Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, Vis-a-Vis Zapata, Splendor in the Grass. This guy is one of the great directors in Hollywood. And he essentially discovered Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. We'll be talking about those guys next time. When everything changes in how acting changes in the 50s because of the method acting. And Elia Kazan was on the forerun of that. Was he a communist in the 30s? He had been a dues paying member, but he was no longer upon. Now he hated communism. And so when he got up on the hearings, he had just directed his first movie, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, won an Academy Award for Best Director. He wanted to keep his career going. And so he did name names. He gave them 8 or 9 different names. He said that he only gave them names that they already had. Well, the people he named were not too happy with that. They were called in and they lost their jobs. They lost their houses. They had to go to jail, a lot of them. Some of them committed suicide. It was so tough on them. And a lot of people blame people like Elia Kazan on that. And he lived a long life, and it always haunted him. And I read his book. It's a wonderful book. He's a great writer, by the way. When he couldn't make films anymore, he became a novelist. But his book, I think it's called A Life, that he wrote, he explains his reasons for naming the names, you got to question yourself. Would I have named names? Would you have named names to save your job? Would you name your friends? Would you sell out your friends? Would you essentially rat your friends out? And that's what it came down to. And a lot of people shunned him for the rest of his life. But it doesn't take away from the brilliance of his directing of these movies. Give you an example of the story. Marlon Brando, the great American actor who essentially reinvented acting in this country from emotionally raw characters that he played. He had already done Streetcar Named Desire, which Kazan directed on Broadway, by the way, and he made a movie with him a couple years later to huge accolades. He had also made the movie Viva Zapata, where Brando played the Mexican revolutionary who was fighting for the good in Mexico. Yes, Brando played a Mexican, and it's a wonderful film. And it's very anti-colonialism. The French were trying to take over Mexico for themselves, and people like Zapata and Pancho Villa fought the French. Not with our support, though, folks. And this is a movie made about that era to great acclaim, critical acclaim. Now, in the meantime, Kazan had named names at the House on Un-American Activities. Brando wrote him a letter saying, I will never work with you again. We are no longer friends. Do not try to contact me. You've sold too many friends out, and you can no longer be trusted. Well, a little while after the letter, Kazan gets this script by Bud Schulman on the waterfront, and he knew only one person could play the part of Terry Malloy, and that was Brando. And so he sent the script to Brando. Well, Brando read the script because he knows he's going to get a good script from him, even though he said don't contact him again. And Brando said, okay, I'll make another movie with you. Now, this movie is one of the greatest movies ever made. Brando won the Academy Award for Best Actor in it. Eva St. Marie, Lee J. Cobb, it's brilliant. It's all about unions, corrupt unions in the docks of Hoboken, New Jersey. Filmed in a real Italian neorealism way. We'll be talking about this next week when I talk about these films. And Brando even set his strict beliefs off to the side to make a movie that he believed in, that they all believed in. So there's the power of cinema right there. House on Un-American Activity. How it all ends, it ends in travesty, but those trials went on for several years. Many people were blacklisted, writers, directors, actors, and they didn't work, folks. They had to change their names, or they worked in Europe, or they worked with pseudonyms, and they had to get a lot less pay. They kept pushing through. One of them, Dalton Trumbull, the great Dalton Trumbull screenwriter, when he was blacklisted, he wrote under a different name. He won the Academy Award, folks. And on the Academy Award night, they announced this person's name. It was a fictitious name. It was Dalton Trumbull, but he didn't attend the awards. Somebody else accepted the awards in his place. It was all fake. So he got his award under a fake person behaving like he was somebody else. That's how insidious it was. The actor Kirk Douglas, who was very powerful at the time, was making a movie called Spartacus, and he needed a writer. And he said, Dalton Trumbull, come write this movie, and I will use your name. You can use your real name. I'll go up against the powers that be, and we're going to say this is a screenplay by Dalton Trumbull. Otto Preminger, another director, German director, by the way, who made a very huge career in Hollywood, did the same thing. And he said, write a movie for me, because he's a great writer, folks. And I will put your real name on the script, the credits, and I will defend you. You have my word on it. And those two guys backed their word, but they were powerful. And they could back down people like McCarthy, who had faded and had died, actually. He was an alcoholic. He's a broken man. And then he was eventually called as a charlatan and a guy who was hunting communists everywhere. He saw communists in your closet. There was a communist under your bed. There were commies everywhere. He saw commies everywhere. And he was out to rid the world of communism. Oh, well. Anyway, and his tragic downfall is eventually killed him early. I don't think he even got into his I think he was in his 40s. You can look that up real easy. Anyway, so that's how powerful this movement was and how real the threat was and how it kind of put a black mark on everything and an asterisk on some people's lives, like Elie Kazan. One final note, Elie Kazan, one of his great friends was Arthur Miller, the playwright. They had done, who wrote Death of a Salesman, famous play. Maybe you've heard about it. They've made it into several movies, by the way. Kazan had directed it on Broadway with Lee J. Cobb. And Miller was was called in to name names, and he didn't. He was willing to sacrifice his career. They slapped him on the wrist. They didn't sign him in prison, and he kept working. And he never spoke to Kazan for another 10, 20 years. They were best friends. Towards the end of their lives, both of them, Miller forgave him. And they sealed it up. Because that's what wisdom brings you. Anyway, so that's House Un-American Activities, important part in our history of cinema, a real black smudge on the face of cinema, and how people outside of Hollywood and cinema don't trust Hollywood at all. They think it's corrupt. A lot of people still do. And then a bit on film noir. And on that note, go watch a film noir. Maybe I'll sign one from their essay. I don't know yet. That's all I got. Keep up the good work. Contact me if you want to have a Zoom meeting. I'll see you next week, and we'll start it all over again when the story of film continues.